Welcome back to the Dershow. I have a letter to the editor, a rather long letter, almost a short article, in tomorrow's Wall Street Journal that you can actually access online now. That's going to infuriate my remaining few Democrat friends. In the article, I compare Trump's first days in office to Thomas Jefferson's first days in office, where he fired all the Federalists who had been appointed by John Adams, where he pardoned all the people who had been convicted under the Sedition Act, where he doubled the size of the country by, without congressional approval, buying the Louisiana Purchase, by imposing trade restrictions, by railing against the judiciary. Very, very, very similar. And read the article, you'll see other similarities. Of course, the big difference is that Jefferson never had a press conference. Jefferson didn't even deliver a State of the Union message. He spoke apparently with an embarrassingly high-pitched, squeaky voice and never made a speech, really, never spoke. Everything was writing. We remember him, obviously, for the Declaration of Independence and for so many other pieces of writing that he did, 10,000 letters or something like that. You know, one of the most brilliant men who ever sat in the Oval Office. And of course, he was the first president, if I'm not mistaken, to sit in the White House. The White House was built then, and he was president when the Capitol was in Washington, not in New York. You remember that from the play Hamilton, in the room where they make the deal to move the Capitol to Washington in exchange for paying the debt. But, fascinating stuff. There are no two presidents that were exactly the same, but and this president is remarkably unique today. Again, calls the press into the Oval Office. They practically live there. And he just off the cuff talks and answers questions and seems to be, very direct. We've had presidents, who've gone months and months and months without having any press availability. They just hide in the Oval Office and they administer the presidency from there. This guy is very much a public president. You love him or hate him. You know where he is on every issue. He doesn't refuse to answer any question. Indeed, you don't even have to ask him. He just gives you his opinion, tells you what's going on in Ukraine, tells you what's going on in the Middle East, tells you what's going on in Congress, tells you what's going on, all over. And so we have the most transparent presidency, I think, ever. And it's driving the Democrats absolutely crazy. They don't have a response to this because when they try to emulate him, they look ridiculous. You have all these politicians screaming and yelling, bouncing up and down, making up stories. For example, a congresswoman today, a Democratic congresswoman said, well, Elon Musk admitted he lied. I mean, that's just such a direct lie. He admitted he was human and he may have made a mistake. He didn't admit he lied. And don't turn a mistake, an innocent mistake, into a lie. He got confused between the Gaza Strip and an area called Gaza in another part of the world. We're all human. And I think this openness is very good for the country. Look, I'm not a defender of everything Donald Trump has done and is doing. I like most of his appointments, many of his appointments, not all of his appointments. I have been critical of Tulsi Gabbard. I don't think she was the best person to be the head of national intelligence in light of what she said about Snowden. Snowden was a traitor. I mean, didn't technically commit treason, but he gave up our secrets. He was sworn to secrecy and he gave them up. No, he shouldn't be pardoned and he shouldn't be treated as a hero. So I disagree with that. And I disagree with some other positions. I'm not a down the line supporter of anybody. I've never supported any president down the line, but whatever you might think, you just got to give Donald Trump enormous credit for his candor and his openness and his willingness to take on these issues and talk about them publicly in ways that obviously will never be perfect. I mean, he's gonna, when you talk like that off the cuff and you don't read from a teleprompter and a script, you're going to occasionally overstate something or make a mistake. And he's certainly had his share over his years of doing that. But he was elected because of who he is. He's also elected because of who his opponent was. But today, if there were an election, he would be an overwhelming favorite to win. He's done, from an electoral point of view, remarkably in his first 3 weeks in office. Just absolutely amazing. His numbers are very high. His approval, his disapproval has, shrunk. It's still high because he is a provocateur. He's not somebody who's out to make friends of his opponents or try to vacillate. He is what he is. He says what he says, and he does what he does. Which brings me to the issue at hand. The Democrats, they are acting disgracefully. First of all, they're just yelling wolf. You know the old story of yelling wolf. They're yelling wolf. They're screaming and yelling that there's a constitutional crisis. There's a constitutional crisis. The Constitution can't deal with Trump. The country may be over. We're hearing this from, distinguished senators, Senator Wyden. We're hearing it from members of Congress. We're hearing it from Democrats all over the place, from Chuck Schumer and others. Let me be very clear as a historian of the Constitution. There has been one, O-N-E, one, count it, one constitutional crisis in our history that our Constitution was incapable of solving. And that, of course, was slavery and the Civil War and the Dred Scott decision and the various provisions of the Constitution which acknowledged slavery. The Declaration of Independence didn't. It talked about all men being created equal, and it originally had in it a provision condemning King George for allowing slavery and importing slaves into the United States. But we couldn't deal with that within the Constitution. That was a crisis. The Supreme Court rendered a terrible decision, Dred Scott, which basically declared that anybody who's African American, even a freed slave, can't be a citizen of the United States. And that couldn't be resolved. It could be resolved by constitutional amendment, but at the time, there wasn't enough votes for a constitutional amendment. They were abolitionists and they were segregationists or slave state people. And of course, it moved west as we acquired more and more land and created more and more states and other units of governance in Oregon and other places, and even Missouri. There had to be decisions about whether they'd be slave or free. And the Constitution, with all its flexibility and its original intent to try to be a constitution forever, and for the long term, that was certainly the Madison, Hamilton, John Jay point of view, not the Jeffersonian point of view necessarily, but the Constitution was not capable of resolving that issue without a war. So we had indeed a constitutional crisis. The Civil War could have been averted. That may have been started by accident. We talked about that the other day, but even if it had been averted, the constitutional crisis would have continued. We would have had states in which slavery was lawful and other states in which slavery was unlawful. And we'd have had the fugitive slave laws where states would be required to return slaves and they wouldn't do it. And it was indeed a constitutional crisis. There was simply no way to resolve it within the law. It took a military defeat and occupation, essentially. The South, at least technically, started the war, although when I got married in Charleston, South Carolina, almost 40 years ago, my wife's family had a friend who was a tour guide, and all of my friends came down, obviously from the North. We're all Northerners, and she was on the bus, and somebody asked her about the Civil War. She said, what was that? You talking about the war of northern aggression? And that's for the rest of the trip. That's all she talked about, the war of northern aggression. And that's the way the South saw the Civil War, even though the first shots were fired on Fort Sumter, a United States government fort by Southerners. So it needed a civil war, and it needed a resounding victory, and it got the resounding victory in the peace treaties with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery and created the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, which was not obviously in the original Constitution. It couldn't have been. In the original Constitution, African American slaves were, less than human. For voting purposes, they were less than a person. And for purposes of freedom, they weren't a person at all. They were property. They could be mortgaged. They could be sold. I mean, even saying those words, it just makes shivers go up your spine. And the idea that the fathers and mothers of our country tolerated that, almost none of them did it happily. They saw it as the least of the alternative wrongs. Mentioned yesterday, we have the wolf by the ears, and either he will devour us or he will devour future generations. And he did. In the Civil War, there was so many casualties. I think there were more American casualties in the Civil War than in any other war fought by America, because, of course, the casualties came on both sides. And the method of fighting was so primitive that people just became cannon fodder. And we treated our immigrants horribly. We would take people who came from Ireland. There was potato famine and obviously other considerations that pushed people from Ireland, tiny little country, to come to the United States. And as soon as these young men left the ship that they had sailed from Ireland, they were immediately conscripted into the army and used as cannon fodder. Many of them were killed. And some of them had to join the army because in those days you could buy your way out of the army. If you were a wealthy person, just pay another person to come in and take your place. And who do you think took their place? Mostly Irish immigrants, some German immigrants as well, but immigrants. We didn't treat our immigrants very well. Excuse me, sorry. And so we had a constitutional crisis. The constitutional crisis could not be resolved by the United States Supreme Court. Compare that to what's going on today. If you listen to Senator Wyden, if you listen to Chuck Schumer, you think we're going to have a civil war. No, listen to Donald Trump. What he said, and he said it again today from the Oval Office. He said, I will comply with every court order, and then I will appeal it. And he didn't say this, but obviously his lawyers say this because it's legal talk, and we will seek a stay. We will immediately go to the higher courts and say, no, you can't allow hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of federal judges sitting in obscure parts of the country, somewhere, in Rhode Island or somewhere in the south of California, to issue an injunction that covers everybody in the United States. I'll read a letter later about that. Good point. Should we really pass a law that says that a single federal judge cannot enjoin legislation or actions that involve the rights of millions and millions and millions of Americans? It's a bizarre situation where Democrat attorney generals can shop for a judge somewhere in the country who they know will issue a favorable ruling, and then get the judge to say that nowhere in the United States can the president's actions be accepted. Fortunately, as an old British saw had it, Her Majesty's, His Majesty's now judges are presumed, everybody, no, the way it goes is this, I'm sorry. Everybody in England is presumed to know the law, except His Majesty's judges, who have a court of appeals above them to set them straight. And having an appellate system, by the way, the United States Constitution doesn't provide for appellate courts. It provides only for a United States Supreme Court and then inferior courts that could be created by Congress. And Congress has created multiple levels of courts. So now what we have is the United States Supreme Court. We have 11, essentially, courts of appeals. And then below them, we have two levels. We have United States District Court judges, And then we have a relatively new concept, new 30, 40 years old, magistrate judges. They used to just be called magistrates. They were like assistant judges. Now we have a whole level of magistrate judges that perform enormously complex functions and can also, make rulings. They are subject, obviously, to review by the district courts. But our system is working. Democrats, don't yell wolf. Don't shout fire. I hate fire in a crowded theater, but don't shout fire in Congress. Don't shout fire. Don't tell us we have to go to the streets. Don't tell us we have to declare war. Don't tell us that there is no political recourse. There is. We have 3 independent branches of the government, not a 4th. The bureaucracy is not in the Constitution. The cabinet that was created in the first years, you know how many cabinet members there were? If I'm not mistaken, there were like 6. I remember my mother taught me how to remember cabinet members when she was in school. She used to love these kinds of things. And she would tell me, if you want to know the cabinet, it's St. Wappernockel. I don't remember what it means. St. Wappernockel. State, Treasury, War, Attorney General, Postmaster General, and then 2 or 3 others. The bureaucracy, when she was in school in the 1920s, was tiny. The states had much more authority, much more power, but we now don't have St. Wappernockel. We have alphabet agencies. We have so many bureaucratic agencies. And what is their status? They're created by the legislature. They're overseen by the judiciary. They're part of the executive. It's very complicated. And President Trump, for the first time, has said, let's look hard at these bureaucracies. Now, I think he's overdoing it in some respects. I think that, foreign aid does a lot of good if it's done in the best interests of humanity, in the best interests of the United States. But it also does a lot of bad. The idea that we would pay tax money to have people in a foreign country get free subscriptions to Politico. And tomorrow, apparently, President Trump's going to stand in the Oval Office and read through these millions and hundreds of millions and billions, and I think he said it may come up to $1 trillion of money that's being spent that are not in the interest of the United States. So again, as usual, both sides are exaggerating. But the Democrat exaggeration is much, much worse, because they are crying wolf. And if we ever did have a constitutional crisis, nobody would believe the Democrats anymore. We do not have a constitutional crisis. We also don't have a budget crisis. We have a budgetary problem. And I think that the administration is painting with too broad a brush. I don't think that all the aid should be cut. We should not be cutting aid to research, medical research. We should not be cutting aid that is necessary to help people, even in foreign countries, survive. And we should not be cutting aid that ultimately is good for the United States, that helps us create alliances that have been. But again, Trump usually has a point. NATO is important, but they should pay for it. We shouldn't be paying for the whole thing. We certainly shouldn't be contributed a single penny to the United Nations. I'd love to see us cut off all aid to the United Nations, every penny. Let Iraq and Iran, let Iran, who's head of the Human Rights Council, let them pay. But I don't see how the United Nations has done a bit of good for the United States or for its allies or for anybody. So, I think what Trump is doing always has a kernel of truth to it. And often, as with any administration, it goes too far. And that's what the negotiating process is about. That's what Trump's all about. He has an opening gambit. He says, no Palestinian should be allowed to come back to Gaza. Now let's talk about it. Let's see what that really means. Does it mean that maybe there should be a 2-mile buffer zone between Israel and the Gaza Strip, where no Palestinian should ever be allowed to walk, where there are electronic fences, and where it can be annexed to Israel as a result of the Hamas attack on Israel, and where the Israeli army can set up whatever barriers it wants. And maybe we should clear out half of the Gaza Strip and push everybody in the other town to the other part while we get rid of all the tunnels and then do the reverse after they're cleared up. I mean, there are so many options, but it's a good thing that President Trump opened up the issue. But of course, what's the Democrat response? Oh my God, how can you even think that or say that, as if they have an alternative? No, they don't have an alternative. So let's consider every option and every proposal, and let's not forget that we have a constitution. As Marshall said, it is a constitution. We are expounding a constitution that is designed to last through the ages. It's done a damn good job for, we're about to celebrate 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, but it's only, the 230 something anniversary of the Constitution of the United States. But boy, has that endured. The Bill of Rights has endured. The constitutional text itself has endured. The two or so dozen amendments have endured. It's a viable document. It's doing its work. So, if you want to change it, fine. If you want to complain about what the administration is doing, that's your right. You're the loyal opposition. You should do that. But don't exaggerate. Don't shout wolf. Don't shout fire when there is no fire, when there is no wolf. Just point out the fallacies, what's wrong. I don't believe that the president of the United States has the power unilaterally to declare that birthright citizenship is should not be followed. I don't think he does. I think if Congress were to pass a statute that defined what the jurisdiction of the United States is, we'd have an interesting case. I'd love to argue it in front of the United States Supreme Court. I don't know how it would come out. Even Dershowitz couldn't predict the outcome of that case because it's so complex, birthright citizenship. But just because the president is pushing a constitutional view further than I think it deserves to be pushed, doesn't mean we have a constitutional crisis. He's submitting it to the courts. The courts will decide the case, and the courts will decide it. It may decide it right, it may decide it wrong. Look, it decided Roe versus Wade wrong, 50 years ago. Then it corrected it. I'm not on the side of restrictions, massive restrictions on abortion, but the Constitution doesn't say anything about abortion. And Roe versus Wade, not only according to me, but according to Justice Ginsburg, didn't have a firm basis in law. Did I think it should be reversed after 50 years? No, certainly not in the case that reversed it, because that issue wasn't raised. But, that's what the Constitution's about. Nobody's going to be thrilled with every outcome in the Constitution, but don't call it a crisis when it's just a conflict. The Constitution is designed to resolve conflicts. That's what we have. That's a good thing. That's part of our system of checks and balances. System of checks and balances was designed to create conflicts between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches. And we have a mechanism for resolving those conflicts. And the mechanism is working. So, to the Constitution, congratulations on 200 and something years of being able to resolve everything but one crisis over the years, conflict over the years. And may you go from strength to strength and continue to resolve conflicts for many, many, many years to come. Okay, let's get some letters. I want to start with a couple of humorous ones. Here's one that says, Alan, it looks like somebody stole the green baseball cap that has been in the corner behind your right shoulder for more than a year. I'd have someone look into it if it was you, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I've had this cap for a long time. I love the saying on it, make free speech free again. I'm the one who took it. I was invited to go to a Celtics game the other night. The Celtics were playing the Heat. Obviously, it was in Florida, so everybody there was a Heat fan, but I wanted to wear the green, and I couldn't find a Celtics shirt, and I couldn't find a green or anything that said Celtics. So I took this hat, make free speech again. I then went online and I got a Celtics logo, and I put the Celtics logo on the hat, and I wore it to the game, and people actually cheered me for wearing my made-up Celtics hat. Unfortunately, about halfway through the game, I had to take it off because I don't think you can see this, but I started to bleed out of my forehead because I had foolishly stapled this piece of paper onto the hat, and one of the staples didn't fold down, and so went into my forehead, and I was bleeding. So I had to take my hat off. But hey, it was fun. Celtics won, down 10 points at the end of the first quarter, won by, I don't know, close to 20. Okay, so thank you for noticing my green hat, and I'll put it back in its usual space. Okay, this is an interesting question. Good stuff. Who decides what you're going to talk about, you or your son? Well, we have a meeting and we talk about it. And we both read, obviously, online at newspapers. And then we make a decision. My wife, gives her ideas. We look at the letters also and see what's on people's mind. And ultimately, I think in almost every case, we agree. Sometimes my son will say, a little too much Israel. Let's get a little bit more Trump in there. So we decide. We strike a balance. Everybody knows what my interests are, and we'll continue to work cooperatively together. Okay, this is a personal one, and I hope the person who wrote it is listening. It would be great. I talked about how funny my neighborhood was. We had so many comedians in my neighborhood. You were successful depending on how good a joke teller you were. So, which is why my dad is so funny too. He grew up in the same neighborhood. I heard it all. Funny jokes told by the funny guys my whole life. You two were in the same class. We were. He said, you probably won't remember him since you were the youngest in the class. I was. Then he said, sadly, but hey, when a nuclear physicist, his father, has a stroke, the logic becomes interesting. But he told me to say hi to you, and his name is Jonathan Farber. And I remember Jonathan very well. He was the smartest kid in our class. And so if Jonathan Farber's son is listening, try to get Jonathan to give me a call, or get in touch with me, or try to reach me. I'd love to have a little nostalgia with somebody that I last saw 73 years ago. So thank you for reminding me of the good old days. Okay. Article 3 of the Constitution has a line. It says, judges, both of the Supreme Court and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior. There seems to be no recourse in how to disqualify a judge, etc. And we can't impeach him because the process of removal for impeachment would need treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors. So I disagree with that. And I made that point when I defended President Trump. I think the criteria for removing judges is different from the criteria for impeaching presidents. I think for a president, it has to be clear. It has to be clearly treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors. But for judges, it has to be continued good behavior. And if you're engaged in bad behavior, which I think Congress has the right to define, they don't have the right to change the words treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors. Maybe they have the right to define what a high crime or a misdemeanor is. I'm not so sure about that, but they haven't done it. But I think for judges, you have more flexibility in removing a judge if you can make an argument that the judge engaged in bad behavior. The words of the Constitution themselves say he shall serve during good behavior. Most people have interpreted that is until he dies. But they could have said that. They could have said easily a judge can serve for as long as he lives. But that's not the case. Good behavior. And of course, judges have been removed without being found guilty of treason, bribery, or high crimes if they are incompetent. Usually it's an informal process. All the judges go to them. But I argued a case in front of a judge, and he was looking at the wrong briefs. And he started asking me questions about a different case. And he shouldn't have been sitting on the bench. And for presidents, we have the 25th Amendment. But for judges, we don't have anything comparable to the 25th Amendment. So we'll see. This is an interesting one. Nostradamus was actually Jewish himself, this letter says. He was a Marrano, a group of Jews during the Spanish Inquisition who adopted Catholic names as well as some of their alterations in their worship to blend into the society behind them. I can't vouch for that, but I wouldn't be surprised if Nostradamus was a Jew. Well, we'll see. Final one. India's foreign minister said it in 2004. Terrorists don't play by any rules. The answer to terrorism cannot have any rules. I don't agree. I don't think that you can attack terrorists without any rules. The terrorists themselves, perhaps you can. Can you torture them? The Constitution prohibits torture in most circumstances. Can you torture a captured terrorist in order to get real-time information to prevent other acts of terrorism? That's been a debate that I've participated in, wrote about it, and there's no simple answer to that. But there are limits. In a democracy, as Aaron Barak said, we have to fight terrorism with one hand tied behind our back because we have a constitution, we have morality, they don't. And our morality is an important weapon in the fight for democracy. So, interesting week. Lots of people watched, and I appreciate all your nice letters, and looking forward to seeing you next week. Who knows what next week will bring? By that time, Saturday will have passed. We'll see if Hamas returns enough hostages to avoid the end of the ceasefire. Interesting times. See you next week.